This podcast is about introducing our fans to the animals, plants, and other products that we work with at Josh's Frogs. It's an opportunity to paint a picture of our hobby that is refreshing. We want you guys to be successful with the animals that you're keeping, and we want our hobby to grow ethically and sustainably into the future. Hello and welcome to the Josh's Frogs podcast. I've got Zach with me. We're going to talk a little bit about his talk that he gave at IHS last week. But before we do that, I just want to remind you that the Josh's Frogs podcast is brought to you by Josh's Frogs. So we're your one-stop shop for all your reptile, amphibian, and pet bug needs. We sell only captive-bred animals. And then we carry everything that you need to take care of those animals. So caging, lighting, heating, decor, live plants, substrates. We do all of that stuff, as well as all the feeder insects you need to take care of all those animals. We want you to be successful. We want you to be informed. So we do a bunch of how-to guides, blogs, articles, that kind of stuff, as well as a bunch of videos and this podcast. We just want you to be successful with what you're keeping. So check us out, joshsfrogs.com, and across to all channels, social media channels, it's Josh's Frogs as well too. So without further ado, welcome, Zach. We're going to talk about your presentation that you did at IHS about ethics in breeding. But before we do that, tell us a little bit about what you do here at Josh's Frogs and how long you've been doing it.
Cool. I'm the vice president of operations. I've been doing that job for a few years. Been here for about, I think it was 17 years last month, which is crazy to think about. My job consists of what I call the fun part of the business. So I oversee plants, insects, and animals and their production and the customer service aspect and expansion and growth there.
Cool. So your presentation focused on 6 different aspects of ethics when it comes to keeping and breeding animals. And the first one you talked about was sourcing. Like, can you walk us through, like, why is sourcing an ethical concern when it comes to animals?
Yeah, so absolutely. With sourcing animals, obviously, if you're thinking about offering animals ethically and providing them, it matters where they come from. So you can think of the traditional sense. Are they legal or are they smuggled? Of course. And, surprisingly enough, I mean, next to drugs and arms, wildlife is the 3rd biggest smuggled thing on the planet. And it's lots of times those same organizations of people that are doing it. So first off, don't buy smuggled animals. We could talk about that a little bit later. Then secondly, it's wild caught versus captive bred. Everything we sell here is captive bred. And then, okay, so you're dealing with a captive bred animal. It's already going to be more likely to be healthier, have less disease issues, do better in captivity than a wild caught animal. But then where you're bringing that from. So are we producing that in-house here? Are we partnering with others who have similar husbandry guidelines, access to veterinary care, quarantine and biosecurity practices, and so on and so forth?
Cool. The second one has to do with husbandry and breeding. Can you talk about some of the ethical concerns that we as a business and we as a hobby run into when we're talking about caring for and breeding animals?
Absolutely, and especially since it's always a moving target. So, if you think about, I'm 39 this year. That feels old. Like how I kept my first ribbon snake when I was 5 compared to how I'd keep a ribbon snake now. Like those expectations as a pet are completely different. On a breeding level, maybe not so much in some cases, really similar. So keeping that in mind, we utilize a lot of bioactive enclosures. A lot of times we find that actually saves a bunch of labor. So it actually reduces the cost of the animal in some way, but it increases the needs of initial setup cost and space. And we want to balance, ethics, of course, and also address, like, we are a business. We pay people a living wage. We provide for our employees. Like, we have to balance that out. Also having the proper facilities. We keep multiple weeks worth of water on hand. The water main in front of the building could blow up and we'd be upset because we couldn't flush toilets for a few weeks, but like our animals would still be misted and have water, and our tadpole systems would still have water changes. And we've hardened our structure like that. We have some backup generators, proper facilities to maintain that kind of level. And then as far as breeding goes, just considering how we're breeding animals. Animals like dart frogs, a lot of them are considered year-round breeders because in the wild that population can breed year-round. That doesn't mean each female produces eggs all year round on a regular basis. So we intentionally cycle our animals. We have a dedicated areas where we can adjust temperatures, reduce mistings, decrease feedings, in some cases physically remove animals. The neat part about that is you may get an animal that, like most of your tinctorius are known for producing 3 to 5 eggs at a time. Maybe they do that for 2/3, 3/4 of a year. Ours might do that for 4 months out of the year, but they're producing eggs in the teens or even the 20s sometimes. So it means the animals live a lot longer. And also you have to figure out what you do with those animals, have a retirement plan in place for your breeders, which is a fun challenge. A lot of them end up in classrooms and such. I've got a few home. But then also you can even end up with animals that are actually a little more prolific. And just the turnover, the generation time. We have my dart frogs are up here. My first dart frogs are old enough to drink this year. We have a lot of animals that are in their teens or 20s that are still producing consistently. So that means the amount of generations you go through from wild caught, you can keep a population outcrossed and avoid inbreeding that much longer by following those processes.
Now, talk a little bit about husbandry and ethics when it applies to somebody who might have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tanks in their room. Like, what are some of the things that they should keep in mind? Almost like disaster preparedness. Like, what are, AC goes out, they lose power. What are some of the things that they should be thinking about when it comes to, like, hey, I want to be an ethical keeper for my animals, and things that might pop up?
Definitely things like, okay, do I have a backup source for food? What happens if I have to leave my home unexpectedly and it's enough of an emergency where I have to leave my home, but not enough to where like there's an impending, if I'm not out in 2 minutes, it's, I'm doomed. Like, so you have time to pack up and plan. Like, do you have maybe a grab cooler with heat packs and some ice packs? So where if you do need to remove your animals out of the enclosures, you can put them in deli cups and take them with you. If you're no longer able to care for those animals, or, if you pass or incapacitated, does like your next of kin or loved one know what to do with those animals? And then also just when it comes to facilities there, like obviously climate control. When I lived in South Texas and I had these dart frogs, like it'd get warm in the apartment because it was an older apartment and the AC wasn't great and I couldn't put in a new AC. So I had a thermostat hooked up to the lights so that if it got too warm, the lights could shut off automatically, and that dropped the tank a few degrees. And then keeping some extra water bottles in the freezer at your beck and call just to be able to put on top of the tank or even in the tank wrapped in a towel or something can really help extend that stuff out.
Cool. The third one is one that I don't think we talk about very often, but it's super important. It's the preventing spread of disease. So talk a little bit about like how we have to be mindful of that and how we do that in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have very strict biosecurity protocols. We're very fortunate to have been blessed with like working with people like Dr. Matt Gray at University of Tennessee, some folks at University of Washington and such that, and even locally here at Michigan State, to be able to actually like work on our biosecurity practices and then help with testing and protocols, and develop. So there's foot baths in place. We have flow of people. So, any of our more at-risk animals, like those fresh animals that are in quarantine, those are cared for at the end of the day. So a keeper will come in, they'll generally tend to our breeders and such, tend to for sale animals. And then towards the end of the day, they tend to the quarantine animals, and then they wash up and leave the building and don't get back into those other animal areas. Doing routine testing on anything new that comes in quarantine. An animal gets quarantined for a minimum of 2 weeks here. All amphibians are tested for both B-Sal, BD, and Rana. We do fecals. They get vet care if they need it. If it's a wild caught animal breeding in for breeding purposes, they may be in quarantine for 6 months or longer. And sometimes they don't leave quarantine, and we actually breed them in quarantine, and it's those captive-bred offspring that leave quarantine. Just to ensure that we're not spreading any of that kind of stuff around. And then not only testing the new stuff, but routinely monitoring our current collection. So even if things look perfectly healthy, just whenever we're testing some new stuff that comes in, doing some swabs from a random assortment of our collection to kind of monitor for that as well.
Cool. I know like for the common hobbyist that might have a few tanks, like I always want to say the first thing is like, to say the quiet thing out loud, like never should you be letting your animal go outside. So there's that, like, we just want to say that, like, there's never a situation where you should be like, I don't want to care for this animal anymore and I'm going to let it go. So beyond that, what are some other things that keepers could do to help prevent disease spread from happening?
Don't house wild caught and captive bred animals together, or even in direct conjunction with each other. If you're going tank to tank, it's different. Like if you were to get all captive bred dart frogs, like say from us, like with our practices, if I was a keeper and I, purchased maybe 6 tanks of dart frogs all from us, I wouldn't necessarily be concerned about using gloves between tanks. But if I was to get them from multiple sources or to have some wild caught animals, gloves, having proper sanitation materials, chlorhexidine, bleach, some of those types of chemicals, our own disinfectant that I'm blanking on right now. That kind of stuff is great to have around just to make sure you're not only spraying down maybe even the exterior of the tank where you're maybe touching the lock and, the door, but also any tools you use in conjunction there. Disinfecting materials from outside. I mean, B-cell hasn't been detected in the US, but, Kitchen and Rana absolutely have. So you could be going in and, grabbing a piece of wood or some moss from outside and potentially introducing that kind of stuff. If you do spend time with your critter and then you're going to go out in the wild, or if you're spending some time in the wild and going out with your critter, wash your equipment off, wash your shoes off, wash your hands really well, take a shower, whatnot. So you're just minimizing that chance of transfer. And then, if you're disposing of wastewater, do it into a municipal water system, or disinfect it. Don't just go and empty your frog tank water out into your garden pond where there's a bunch of native amphibians or something.
Cool. All right. The next one is benefiting wild population. So talk a little bit about our responsibility to do that and how we're doing that.
Yeah. So, I say back in the day, I can remember a lot of the books I like to read, or a lot of the natural history people or animal collectors from back in the day. And it used to be nature was this giant infinite resource, and it was our right to do whatever we wanted to it. We could never harm or exhaust it. There was always more nature somewhere. And we're definitely in a position now where we know that's not true. So we went from it didn't matter what we did to, okay, let's keep stuff in captivity, but not cause harm to those wild populations. So captive-bred only, things like that. And we switched to a model that's, I think, one of the more enjoyable parts of my job. Definitely, it's a big motivator. Is how can what we do here? How can people keeping frogs in glass boxes benefit those wild populations of those animals? And we've approached that in a few different ways. So, of course, captive-bred only. We also are making sure when we do bring in wild cots for founding populations, they have to come from somewhere. We do so in as low impact manner as we can. So instead of bringing in 200 of something, we might bring in 6 of something, knowing that, okay, it's going to take an extra year or two to produce a captive-bred generation of breeders, but that means that we're only taking 6 animals from the population instead of 200. A lot of times those animals may even be juveniles, so they're not even on the breeding population level. Along with that, it's just really, 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 really important to make sure. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Actually, where were we at?
How we benefit wild populations. I think you're transitioning to, okay.
Yeah, I was, sorry. I was sitting there and I was going for a little loop there. So how we're benefiting wild population, there's 2 big ways we do. One of the ways is it's how we source some animals, and we're working with some entities, some companies, some groups of people in a country of origin, to where we're buying animals that are produced actually in captivity in a biosecurity in Panama. They're exported to us. We use them as breeder stock, or we sell those animals. And those purchases are helping those companies grow their operations, which means they're taking more and more pressures off those wild populations in the country of origin. And a huge chunk of that revenue those animals are generating are actually staying in the country of origin, which I think is a huge model we can replicate. We also have our direct conservation partnerships where say you buy a mantella from us. We tally up how many mantellas we sold at the end of the year. And then for every mantella we sold, $5 goes to Association Minsinju in Madagascar. They're located outside of Indasa Bay, and they actually do training. They have academics visiting from all over the world involved with amphibian conservation in Madagascar. They do field surveys. They actually hire people who live in the area and employ them, and also they can even do things like hiring people to actually live on land and monitor amphibian populations to ensure that they're protected. And they have a biosecure facility they're breeding animals into to kind of figure more out about them, to where maybe it's not, we have to remove these and breed these in captivity to save the species yet, but that data will exist when that's necessary. Then lastly, we have our annual amphibian conservation grant. So funded by our animal sales, we give away a certain amount of money every year to different grants, $500,000 or $1,500, kind of micro grants that can impact either direct in situ amphibian conservation, so where they live, or doing research that could benefit in the wild. And then I know a portion of our sales using Josh's Frogs Pay goes directly to Amphibian Arc, which does a lot of the same stuff. Why let the credit card companies get that money when we can save frogs with it? So.
That's right. Exactly. Cool. Next one is supporting amphibian owners. Talk a little bit about how that applies, and why that's something that we're responsible for doing.
Yeah. So we can produce a lot of frogs. I ran some numbers for the prep for IHS, and if you took 6 red-eyed tree frogs, and in 2 generations, if you assumed even gender ratios and survival rates, you could have 18,000 frogs theoretically. you can make a lot of frogs, but you have to make sure if you're going to make a lot of frogs that there's a good place for those frogs to go. One thing we don't want to do is produce 4 times more than frogs of something that nobody's buying. Like, what happens to those animals? What does that look like? So it's supporting those amphibian owners to like making sure like there's a market for these animals, but then also before they purchase these animals, they're familiar with the care of the animal, that, you know, dart frogs can live 20 or 30 years. You know, what those expenses look like over time, and then making sure after they've purchased that animal, they have access to further information, you know, any food, any supplies they need, all that kind of guidance. So basically, from kind of cradle to grave or whatnot, like they're in a position to take proper care of that animal its entire lifespan. I think that's different, like for us, because we are kind of a one-stop shop. But that even applies to like someone who bred, you know, say somebody who has a clutch of red-eyed tree frog eggs and it's their first clutch of amphibians. If they're selling those, they can still do things to ensure that people are getting resources. Maybe like us, they're providing a basic care sheet. Honestly, there's absolutely nothing wrong with people even pointing people back and like, hey, linking here, I'll email you. Here's a link to Josh's Frogs care sheet. Like, cool, we're there to help out. You know, to make sure that they have the resources they need to be successful.
Yeah, I think thinking about it less in terms of competition and more in terms of like, how do we make people successful so they stay in our hobby for the long term?
Yeah, 110%.
All right, the last one you have is that we're responsible for when it comes to ethics of breeding is that we're acting as a resource for others. Like, can you talk a little bit about how we do that and why that's so important?
Yeah, exactly. And we've seen like time and time again, where like, you know, people who are against keeping pets, they're kind of looking at it and being like, you know, animals shouldn't be kept as pets. We're not going to change their minds about that, but like the value of what we're doing, and anyone breeding animals, if they're cognizant of it, they can be much more than just, hey, we have these animals for sale. We've done a great job of partnering with zoos and public aquaria, providing animals for research or education or outreach or enrichment. You know, being able to actually even participate in studies. You know, we've done a lot of different things here. I know with our yellow spotted climbing toads, it was really cool. We were producing them for about a decade. Then we had somebody reaching out being like, hey, I'm researching this species and I'm publishing a paper, and there's no information that has any supporting direct evidence outside of like casual observation about like how big their egg clutches are. We're like, oh, we can tell you how big the last 17 egg clutches have been and how they in that. And it's cool to be able to provide that kind of information that based on that, that can really impact like what that species survival looks like. Yeah. You know, being able to look at what disease mitigation in the trade looks like, and just really getting comfortable having conversations with, I think I've heard it often as like almost different silos that people interact with, like, you know, lawmakers, you know, researchers, scientists, zoo field. Historically, them and the pet trade haven't been like the best of friends, but like there's a lot we can learn and help each other out on. So if we're here, we're producing a lot of data, we're figuring a lot of things out, just sharing that. And not only to pet owners, but to, you know, others that can utilize that data in different ways and hopefully help keep our pet trade healthy and growing.
Cool. Just to recap, Zach talked about 6 different areas that we need to be cognizant of when we're keeping amphibians. First is sourcing. Second is husbandry and breeding. Third is preventing spread of disease. 4 is benefiting wild populations. 5 is supporting keepers. And then 6 is acting as a resource for others. So thanks a lot for sharing that and dropping some wisdom on us and educating us on this. It's more than just producing animals. We have a responsibility when we do that. And thanks to you for calling that out. I appreciate that.
Thanks for having me.
Want to do a lightning round to finish us off? If money, space, and legality were no issue, like there were no issues at all, what's your dream pet that you would keep?
I feel like I need to change this every time. You know, assuming legality and stuff are an issue, I'd love to have some kind of an enclosure with a larger size monitor. Assuming I could have an appropriate size enclosure, like maybe I have like a Komodo dragon in like 4 acres or something, but just something like that's large. It's about as close to a dinosaur as you can get, and like being able to like properly house and observe that. Now, so there's no way that could properly happen, you know, but it's a cool idea to think about.
That is cool. All right. Besides Josh's Frogs, what's one brand in our hobby or one breeder or one influencer that you think is just doing really cool stuff? So who would
I think there's a lot of people doing really cool stuff. I think I'd like to speak like more generally. I'm seeing a huge revolution in tanks. Like the past couple of years, and that's continuing. I know we're working on some projects here too, but it's just cool to see larger, less expensive enclosures that are more available to everyone. That isn't, it used to be an aquarium or take some plywood and make this. And I get really excited about what that means. So not that animals, necessarily in order to thrive and be happy may need a giant enclosure, but like that's more attainable for the average person than it has been before. That's really cool to see.
Favorite animal, plant, or bug, insect in our planet? What's your favorite thing? What's the
On our
coolest?
planet, I'm still really favorable to Atelopus toads. They're cool. A lot of species that breed near waterfalls, they have a call, but they also wave to visually signal to each other. They're really fun to watch, and that's a dream species of mine. So
All right, last question. You have a bunch of people listening to you. You can give them any advice that you could possibly give. Maybe it's a reminder of something. Maybe it's an encouragement to do more of, or maybe it's to stop doing this, start doing this. What's one piece of advice you'd give to the people listening?
be excellent to each other. That's great. But also just more practically, I think giving yourself, permission to think through things before you make decisions. I think, especially now, I think a lot of people just feel a lot of pressure to get a lot done, and just giving yourself permission to take some time and think through things and all that, and not feel like you have to compel an answer like in the moment or whatnot. So I'm answering your question with saying take some time before you have to answer or whatnot. I think that applies to all walks of life.
Very wise, very wise. You guys have probably seen Zach in a bunch of videos, read a bunch of his writing on our blogs and articles and how-to guides. So check him out. He does a lot of stuff for us across a bunch of social media channels, including our website. So thanks a lot for reminding us, educating us, and calling us to do what we're doing in a more ethical manner. So thanks a lot for doing that. Appreciate it. And thank you guys. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoy this content and want to stay up to date, make sure to like, subscribe, and follow us across social media. We always want to bring you the best content, so let us know what you think in the comments. And for all your reptile and amphibian needs, be sure to check us out at joshsfrogs.com. We have an amazing selection. Until next time, stay curious, stay froggy, and keep exploring.